Senator Zell Miller is living proof that you can go anywhere from Young Harris College. But with all of the places that he's gone, he's never really left this institution. He remains a part of it. He remains a heart and soul of it. And it is always a pleasure and honor to welcome him back home. I would like to tell you that at the end of the program, if you would like to purchase any of Senator Miller's books, they're available at the campus bookstore across the plaza. The forum this afternoon will feature approximately an hour of Mr. Short conversing with Senator Miller and asking questions. There will be time for questions and answers from the audience at the end of this portion, so please, if you have questions, hold them until then. Finally, I'd like to invite you all back to the Thursday, November 2nd conversation with former Governor Joe Frank Harris, and the Thursday, November 16th conversation with former Governor Roy Barnes. Both sessions will be held in the Wilson Lecture Hall in the Goolsbee Center, and both will start at 3:15 p.m. Again, welcome to the campus of Young Harris College.
Thank you, and welcome again to another in our series of reflection. I know that Zell Miller needs no introduction to this group, so I will begin by asking this question. What shall I call you? Senator, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Professor, or by your college nickname, Zip.
I'm afraid there's not much zip. You left out one of my favorites. My grandchildren and great-grandchildren call me Pawpaw.
Incidentally, how did you get that nickname, Zip?
Well, I don't know exactly. I think it was my speed on the baseball. Or maybe it's how I got out of class. I don't know.
Well, I presume I may call you Senator.
How about friend? We went to school here 55 years together.
Did you have to say that? Well, friends, you live just down the street from this Young Harris campus yet. You seemed a bit reluctant to participate in this forum. Care to tell us why?
Well, that's true. Because I've been on the playing field a long, long time. And I want to get up in the stands and watch what's going on instead of being down there on the playing field. I quit doing commentary for Fox News back in January because I just didn't want to get into all of that. As many of you know, or some of you know, this long political career I've had has had its share of conflicts and controversy. You know, politics is a contact sport, and I have got the skin chins and bloody noses to show it. I don't want to talk too long, but when I first got into politics, I ran against the chairman of the Democratic Party here in Downs County. He was sort of a political boss. Well, that was a rough campaign. Then when I went to, I won, and then when I went to the Georgia legislature in the Senate, the very first thing we had to face was the integration of public schools in Georgia question. And the first night I was down there, one of the reporters asked me, what did I think about integrating the schools? And I said, integrating the school is not the worst thing I can think of. The worst thing I can think of is closing the public schools in Georgia. Well, there were some who didn't like that. Well, then later, I worked for a number of governors, including Governor Lester Maddox as his chief of staff. And there were many who didn't particularly like me working for Governor Maddox at that time. And then I ran for lieutenant governor. And my good friend Paul Caldwell was here from Union County, and he will remember that for 16 years, we kept a fight going between me and Tom Murphy that just went on about all the time. By the way, he's a great man and a great friend. He's in bad shape these days, so I hope you'll remember him in your prayers. But anyway, and then I got into 2 fights as lieutenant governor that ricocheted all the way up here and made a lot of people angry. One was we were building 515 highway up through here, and a lot of people didn't want that done. There was an organization called SMAC, Stop Mountain Area Super Highway. Anyway, there were a lot that didn't like that. And that's one of the reasons it stops over here at Blair's. And doesn't come on through down here. And then I wanted to do a bypass around Young Harris. And there were a number of people in this community that didn't want to do that, so we stopped that. And then I had what was called the Mountain Protection Act. Some of you may remember that, where I wanted to kind of limit the cutting of trees on high mountain ridges. And that stirred up a lot of anger. And then I ran for governor with the lottery as the main issue. And I couldn't even go to church without getting caught up into a lot of controversy. And then after I got elected governor, we had to do away with the flag, changing the flag. So I have had a lot of controversy and a lot of conflict in my life, and I haven't even brought it up what happened in Washington, D.C. So what I'm ready for is a little peace in the back.
All these years I've known you, you've been a proud man of the mountains. Your roots are deeply embedded here in the towns of Union County. And your family grew up there. And the choice story of it. Would you mind telling us just a little bit about your family and their relationship with Young Harris College?
Yeah, I could talk about that for a long time. I'll try to make it brief. I could talk about it for a long time because I'm very, very proud of it. I'll tell it this way. In 1834, now the Indians had not been pushed out of this area until about 1836 along there. In 1834, they had a census of Union County. This was part of Union County at that time here. And in that 1834 census, there were 162 names, heads of households. One of those names was Thompson Collins. Thompson Collins was my great-great-grandfather. And he settled over, as Bob said, in the Choice Story area. And I'll leave him for a minute, and that was on my father's side. On my mother's side, my mother was a Bryan, B-R-Y-A-N, from South Carolina. And my great-grandfather, Bryan, was wounded fighting with Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville, and then wounded again fighting at Gettysburg, where his brother, who was with him, was killed. That was ancient history, kind of, but my father came to Young Harris and graduated from here. His name was Stephen Grady Miller, and graduated from here in 1912. And he went to the University of Georgia, got his bachelor's and master's, and then World War I came along, and he joined the Army, and he was overseas, and he stayed after the war was over and went to King's College in London and got some more education. And then came back in 1919 to teach here at Young Harris College. That same year, a woman by the name of Bertie Bryan, who had seen a notice about them needing an art teacher at this little Methodist college in North Georgia, and applied and got the job, she came. She came by train to Murphy, and there a stagecoach met her and brought her to Young Harris College, and she got here in the middle of the night. And the next morning she woke up and saw this beautiful place and never wanted to leave. To make a long story short, she and Grady Miller, still in his uniform. He still wore his uniform a good bit because he didn't have the money to buy the clothes, I guess, and also I guess he was proud of it. Anyway, they fell in love, these two young Harris College teachers, and married in 1921. And they lived in various houses that the college owned, faculty houses. They lived in Hamby Hall, right behind this chapel. They lived over kind of behind where Appleby Hall is now, what we call the Outler House. And then when I was born in 1932, they were living over here where Coach Luke Rushton lived, and kind of over in that area where Coach Bob Nichols lives, in that house there. And in 1932, 17 days after I was born, my father died. And left my mother no home because they were living in faculty housing, no car. He left her a $1,000 insurance policy. And her father wanted him to come home. And she wanted to stay here. She wanted her children to grow up where folks knew their daddy, our daddy. And so she bought from Mr. Charlie Corn 2 acres of land down there where that rock house is for $198. I've got the check still. I can show it to you. And then with the rest of that money, she hired some carpenters and rock masons to build a house. She had seen these beautiful rocks in Corn Creek. It goes down by the Ball Diamond and on up that way towards Double Knobs, and she had the idea of building a house out of those rocks. And so in the spring of 1932 and summer, this young widow, got down in that creek and would take those rocks and pile them up on the bank. And on Saturday, the college would send a truck over there and haul them down to where the building site was to help her out that much. And she worked on that house until she ran out of money. Spent that $700 and some odd dollars that was left, $800. And it was never finished at that time. But that's where I grew up. I sleep in the same bedroom I slept in whenever I was a 6-month-old baby. She moved us in there as soon as she could. She said that there weren't even any windows in that house when we moved in, and a dog came in and ate the butter off the dining room table the first night we were there. And it was a wonderful place to live. It was always a work in progress. And she worked on it. In 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, she was a very patriotic woman. She wanted to help out in the war effort, and so she took me and my sister Jane and took us to Atlanta. And she worked at what was called the old Bell Bomber plant. And we lived in Atlanta as soon as the war was over. But just a few days after the war was over, she brought us back up here. And I've lived here off and on ever since. And so I appreciate Lee talking about you can get anywhere from Young Harris, because you can. And also Thomas Wolfe is wrong, you can go home again.
You were a student here at Young Harris when there was an academy. You finished the academy and then you finished college. Do you mind telling us some of your more pleasant, fondest memories of your time here on campus?
Well, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I had an idyllic childhood. I walk these creek banks and fields now that I walked whenever I was a boy, and it was a wonderful existence. When we came back from Atlanta, we came back in 1945, the summer of 45, and I started at Young Harris. Back then, they had all 4 grades of high school. And I was so shy that you can look in the Young Harris annuals and you won't see my picture because I was too shy to have a picture made. And until 1948, when I did have it made in a sports shirt. But this chapel has so many memories. We used to have a regular chapel. That bell out there that no longer rings much anymore. Used to be the bell that would wake you up in the morning and that would make the signals to change classes. I can remember that I was a town student, and the town student sat down here, right along in here. And I can remember looking up at this wall and seeing a big photograph of Dr. Sharp, and on the other side, my father. And I always kind of thought he was watching me from up there. And having to live up to something, be somebody, as my mama used to put it. And I can remember working down in the basement of this chapel with one of the most wonderful women, one of the most wonderful persons I've ever known, who changed my life tremendously, by the name of Edna Harris, who was the English teacher. I loved Miss Harris. If she taught a course, I took it. If she advised some campus club, I joined it. She was the one who first persuaded me to try to make a speech. She literally pushed me practically out of the stage. I had joined, there were two debating societies, Young Harris and Phi Chi. I had joined the Phi Chi's because my father had been a Phi Chi, and that's what my mother wanted me to do. But I joined it, I joined it because they played each other in sports, and I loved sports. And so I had to join the Phi Chi's in order to participate in sports. And you also, one of the requirements was to give a debate once a semester. And after I'd been in there for about a year and a half, they finally noticed that that quiet little Miller feller hadn't given a debate yet. And so they assigned me to give a debate, be a part of a debate. It was held down there in what was called the Charles Reed Building, just right down here at the bottom of the hill, where the Gooseby Building is now. And my father had been a debater, a champion debater, and my mother thought I had a lot to live up to. I'm answering these questions way too long, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're not either.
Anyway, I participated in that debate. I can't remember what the subject was. I can remember it had something to do with inflation and recession. About whether it was better to have had an inflation and then have a recession. Anyway, I remember I used the line that it's better to have risen and fallen than never to have risen at all. I thought that was something about like 407 years ago. But anyway, we won the debate. And it was a wonderful feeling to participate in something like that and win. I've always been very competitive. And to make a long story short, I later got elected by the Phi Chi's to what we call the champion debate team. And the champion debate was this debate that was held at the end of each school year in this chapel. And it was a big, big deal. I can remember being in this chapel. The windows would be open because it was in the summer and warm. There would be people outside, out on the grounds. There'd be people sitting in the windows. There'd be people standing in the doors. This place was packed. It was a big deal. Anyway, I got to participate in 4 champion debates with some of the most wonderful friends that anyone could have, including people like Ed Jenkins, Jack Brinkley, both of whom were congressmen. Guy Sharp, you may remember him as the weatherman for Channel 5. And it was a wonderful experience. So to ask me about this campus is to ask me about my family. I wrote in The Mountains Within Me, that first book I wrote about 30 years ago. I said my life at Young Harris College, I think I wrote that it has been entangled like honeysuckle on an old fence ever since I was a baby. I love this institution very much. It meant so much to me. There was a president here by the name of Dr. Charles Clegg, who was a magnificent human being. And I'll talk to you later about him when Bob, I guess, gets around to asking how I finally got into politics. But Dr. Clegg, for whom this building is named, was like a father to me. And he is the one, in 1958, when I was at the University of Georgia working on my doctorate, offered me $400 a month to come up here and teach political science. And I nearly ran people off the road getting up there.
After leaving young Harris, you eventually joined the Marines. In your book here, Core Values, leaves the impression that the Marine Corps and your service, military service, changed your life.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. My life needed changing in some ways. I don't think I'll go into how I happened to. Some of you are smiling, you already know. I have a cousin that I am so very, very proud of, by the name of Eric England, who is sitting right over here. He's a descendant of Thompson College. He was a career Marine, a sniper instructor, a Marine sniper in Vietnam, and he had gone ahead and joined the Marine Corps about 2 or 3 years before that, but he had come home and he'd be the sharpest looking Marine I'd ever seen. And I kind of wanted to be like that, but I didn't have the nerve, didn't have it to go and join. And then an incident occurred in my life. I was drinking moonshine liquor one August 1953. I had never tasted beer or any kind of alcohol while I was in high school or while I was in junior college, but then I did after I left Young Harris, and it got me into a lot of trouble. To make a long story short, I ran my car in a ditch, and the sheriff got me, as he should have, handcuffed me, and put me in the back of that sheriff's car, and took me to the Gilmer County Jail, where I spent the night. I spent the night in the drunk tank with 4 other people. There were 3 old guys there. I don't guess they were too old, but I thought they were. There were 3 old guys there in overalls, and I never will forget it. There was this one kind of dandy there in seersucker pants, and a white dress shirt, or what had been a white dress shirt. And the place was so dirty you couldn't even lay on the bunks. I remember sitting cross-legged on the floor the whole night. Make a long story short, my good friend Max Nicholson came over there the next afternoon here, got me out and brought me home. And it was an epiphany. It was a Sunday afternoon when he brought me home. And I went to Sharp Memorial Methodist Church that night, found my way out there, and sat on the back row and listened to those old familiar hymns that I knew the words of by heart. And I thought about the shame that I had brought my mother and brought my aunts and uncles and kinfolks and Miss Heron and Dr. Clegg and all these folks who had put their trust in me. And I remembered Eric in the Marine Corps, and I remember seeing that Marine Corps poster that said, "We make men." And I thought to myself, all right, see if he can make something out of this guy. And so I joined the Marine Corps. And it was a life-changing experience. The Marines have this saying, the change lasts forever. It does. I went into the Marine Corps in August of '53. In fact, I got out in August of '56, which was 50 years and 2 months tomorrow that I got out of the Marine Corps. And everything that I've seen since then has been filtered through that Marine Corps filter. And I later wrote a book called Core Values, C-O-R-P-S, Values. Everything you need to know I learned in the Marine Corps. That was the subtitle. And it did have a significant effect on me. that has lasted to this day, and probably and undoubtedly will go to the grave with it.
After, I might mention, and I failed to ask this question. While in the Marine Corps, you married and had your first son,
Yep.
and your wonderful wife Shirley and your son Murphy went with you to the University of Georgia,
Yep.
where you studied history, I believe.
Yep.
And while you were still a student at the University of Georgia, you were elected mayor of Young Harris.
Yep. You didn't run for the job back then, they drafted you. They just put you in it. My mama had been on the city council for over 20-something years. And I haven't talked much about my mama, and everybody thinks their mamas are remarkable, and they are, each and every one of them. But she was an unforgettable human being, any of you that ever knew her. And a strong, strong, strong person. But anyway, where were we, Bob?
You're now mayor of Young
I'm
Harris.
now mayor of Young Harris. They gave me the books that had the list of everybody that had been fined over the years in it. They gave me a 38 special, Smith & Wesson, and they gave me a blackjack. And here, when I was sworn in, I took that blackjack and I hit it on the table and I said, the council will come to order. We had a law house right down here. It's gone now, but right down here where the parking lot of Goolsby is right now. A little wooden building, about the size of a single, of a 12-foot wide trailer. There's a small little house. That's where you voted around here.
Well, after, as you said, after the university, you came back to Young Harris as a professor.
Yep.
And it was at that time that you first offered for the state legislature.
Yep.
And you won.
Yep.
You might
I assume you want me to tell you that story.
I do.
First of all, how in the world does somebody teaching at Young Harris College get into politics and stay teaching at Young Harris College? This is where Dr. Clegg comes in so very strong. Dr. Charles Clegg was the president. He's the one that hired me to come back up here and teach. And a Senate seat came. I've been here about a year. A Senate seat came open. That you need to know this. Senate seats back then, you did not run in the 3 or 4 or 5, 6 counties that made up the district. You ran it, the seat rotated between the counties. This was the 40th senatorial district. And it rotated between Rayburn, Towns, Union. And it was Towns' time. And as I mentioned a while ago, a man by the name of W.K. Kaiser Dean was running for office. And I was a young idealistic professor and thought that I could do better than Mr. Dean could down there. I look back on that, and it's obvious I just wanted his job. But I went to see Dr. Clegg, and I told him, I said, if you will let me run for office, run for this Senate seat, I will teach 4 courses, and I will take off winter quarter. The legislature back then met for 40 days and 40 nights, and it really stayed that way. It didn't do like it does now. But I said, if you'll let me go down there and serve during winter quarter, I will teach 4 courses spring quarter, I will teach 4 courses fall quarter, and I'll teach summer school. I'll get all my teaching in. To my surprise, Dr. Clegg said, yes, go ahead and do it. Looking back on it, I have no doubt that what Dr. Clegg was thinking was, he will get beat. And then he'll settle down and maybe make me a pretty good teacher. We'll let him get it out of his system. Well, I won. And so I went to the General Assembly and served in the Senate. The election, it was in April of 1960. It was quite an experience. I don't know if you want me to go into how there were 8 precincts in Towns County. There was Young Harris, there was Brasstown and Gumlog together, there was Hiawassee, there was Macedonia, there was Upper High Tower, Lower High Tower, the river, you know where I'm talking about, like you go across Unithorn. And then there was Tate City, where you had to go into Rayburn County to come back into it to get to it. No one would vote in this election except Democrats. It was a Democratic primary. And back then, you could take a voter's list, and you could go down the list, and by the person's name, you could tell whether they were a Democrat or Republican. All the Dentons and Brysons were Democrats. All the Woods and all the Shooks were Republican, and so forth. And so you would take a voter's list. I had a man by the name of Guy Pewitt. I don't know if any of you remember Guy Pewitt or not. He was the elementary school principal out here. He really knew this county. And we would take the voters list, and we would put a 0 by the Republican's name, which meant that I no use going to see them. We'd put a difference by the Democrat's name, need to go see that person, and then we'd put a minus by a person's name that today would be called independent. Sometimes they voted in the Democratic primary, and sometimes they didn't. We called them floaters back then. And so I would get up every morning, real early. There's nothing that makes a voter happier back then. They're spoiled now. Nothing made a voter happier back then than for a candidate to come see them and knock on their door and talk to them. And if you came before breakfast, that meant you really wanted to see it. And so I'd get up at daylight and I'd knock on all the doors. I would go up Buck Scuffle Road one morning. I'd go up Bear Meat the next morning. I'd go up Owl Creek the next morning. I'd go up to Lower High Tower and scout away the next morning. I knocked on every Democrat's door, plus all those voters' doors too. Either early in the morning before class started or late in the evening. It also was good politics to get a person up at night. Now that showed you were really interested in their vote. And I have waked up hundreds of people in town back then to ask them for their vote. They had put in a little radio station over in Murphy, WCDP. I went over there and I made a speech. Nobody had ever done that before. We had a janitor here, a great man who could play a fiddle like you've never heard, named Lee Kirby. I got Lee to go up to the Towns County courthouse with him when court was in session and fiddled. And I got up on one of those rock columns and made him a speech. Well, to make a long story short, I won by 151 votes. And I was the new state senator from the 40th district. And I guess that's where we stopped. Now we go to Atlanta, right?
Sure. Well, let me ask this question. You were a member of the Senate class of 63.
Yeah, let's talk about 61 first.
All right, 61.
Because that's important.
All right, you were a member of the Senate class of 61.
Yeah. I was 27 when I was running. I was 28 when I started serving. The reason I guided him towards 61, he already knows this, of course. The reason I wanted to guide him there was because 61, important year in Georgia history. A very important year in Georgia political history. Because what happened was this. The session was to start on January the 9th, 1961. On January the 7th, the federal courts said that the University of Georgia would be integrated. And then, of course, the public schools would be next. Well, the legislature had already passed a law saying that if any public school system was integrated, that immediately you didn't have to send your children to school. The mandatory going to school was out. You just didn't have to send them to school. Well, we met on the 9th. That occurred on the 7th. It was a chaotic situation when the legislature started convening in January of 61. There were protesters everywhere. There was a riot at the University of Georgia where they had to take Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter out and get them safely out of there. Ernie Vanderbilt from Livonia was the governor at that time. He had run for governor saying, "No, not one." In other words, not one African American would enter our public school system. That's what he had said. And he had been elected by carrying 156 of the 159 counties. So that's what we got into. And that was why I was telling you a while ago. The first day of the session, Ernie Vanderbilt called a meeting out at the governor's mansion of the 50 top leaders in the General Assembly to ask them, what should we do? 50 of them. 48. 48 said, 48 said close the schools. Only 2 out of that 50 said integrate them and keep them open. Those 2 men were Carl Sanders, and he was a senator then, and Frank Quitty, a representative from Miller. It was a lot of turmoil. I'll hurry it through. On January the 19th, Ernie Vanderbilt made a speech to a joint session of the General Assembly. I will never forget it. It was historic. It ought to be remembered more than it is. In that speech, this man who had run on the platform of "No, not one," said, in essence, that you've got to integrate the schools. He had a phrase in there, something like, "This issue is a cancerous issue." He called it a cancerous issue that will devour progress. I'll never forget that phrase. That will devour progress and everything in its path. It was a brave and courageous speech for a governor, especially Ernie Vanderbilt, to make. I think it's one of the historic speeches in all of Georgia history. To make a long story short, with the governor leading the way, we in Georgia then voted to integrate the schools, not to close them. And Georgia was spared what Alabama and Arkansas, Little Rock, and all these other and some of these other states later had. And it was because of the leadership of Ernest Vanderbilt's governor.
Class of 63.
Class of 63. All right. Another thing that had happened in that first term was that they had done away with the county unit system. They had also changed how you ran for the Senate. Instead of it rotating between the counties, they now put you in the area in several counties. They made this district, for example, a district that stretched from Jasper, Pickens County, all the way over to Habersham, Clarksville, and Cornelius. Towns was just a small part of it. I ran, Carlton ran that year for the House, right, Carlton? And anyway, I got elected. I got re-elected. I got elected again. There were only 5 senators who were in that 61-62 class. There were only 5 who came to the 63-64 class. And I won. I got tremendous support out of Union County. I carried Towns County 1,135 to 17. I don't think I could do that these days, do you? Anyway, that was a great Senate. It was the first reapportioned Senate. In that Senate was a governor, a man who was going to become president, Jimmy Carter. There was 2 that were going to become would-be huge business leaders, J.B. Fuqua and Brooks Pennington of Pennington City, and a number of others. It was really a fresh day start in Georgia. This is when I think the new modern Georgia began. And I was proud to be a part of that.
You decided to run for lieutenant governor. I assume after much soul searching and inner debate. What made you decide to run?
The same thing that made me want to run against Kaiser Bean years earlier. The lieutenant governor's job in Georgia used to be a very, very good and powerful position. It's not that way anymore. They've changed it around too much. The lieutenant governor appointed all the committees, appointed the chairman of all committees, assigned all the bills, appointed the conference committees, did it all. He was a powerful person. And in the meanwhile, we skipped over this, Bob, I had worked for 3 different governors. I worked for Carl Sanders when he was governor. I worked for Lester Maddox when he was governor. I worked for Jimmy Carter when he was governor. And Jimmy Carter had appointed me the director of the Georgia Democratic Party. And I got to meet a lot of people being in the state capitol like that. And I just thought I knew enough people to run for lieutenant governor, so I ran. In that race was, I think, 11 or 13 candidates, including Max Cleveland. He was running as a young state senator. I got in a runoff with a female mayor from Jessup named Mary Pitt, and I won that in the runoff. I never will forget one of the first questions I was asked. They asked me, what do you think about women being in politics? Well, my mother, as I said a while ago, was a city council member here in Young Harris for 20-something years. She was the mayor twice. At one time, she was one of 2 female mayors in Georgia. And so I said, well, I've never known anything else. But anyway, I won that, and I ran against a Republican named John Savage, a good guy, and I was elected lieutenant governor.
Rolling the clock forward now to 1980, when you decided to run against the legendary Herman Talmadge for the United States Senate. Tell us about that race.
Well, everybody makes mistakes. I never will forget, I had a good friend named Peter Zach Geer, who had been the executive director, executive secretary of Governor Vanderbilt. And then he had been lieutenant governor, and I'd worked with him, and he and I had been very good friends. And so I called up Peter Zach. He lived down in South Georgia, in North County down there. I called Peter Zach up and I said, Peter Zach, I think I'm going to run against Herman Talmadge for the Senate seat. There was just silence on the other end of the phone. He said, have you lost your mind? He said, you're taking on the he-dog, the alpha in some of your language. And anyway, I went ahead and ran anyway, and got him in a runoff. There were 2 other real good candidates running. Norman Underwood, who later became a judge on the Court of Appeals, and Dawson Mathis, who was a congressman from South Georgia. But Senator Talmadge and I got in a runoff, and it was a brutal, mean race. And out of it, we both came so scarred up that later the Republican candidate beat Senator Talmadge, and it would be 10 years before I could put enough of myself back together where I could run for governor in 1990. I made 2 races in my life I shouldn't have made. That was wrong. Of the Transportation Committee in the House for years and years, and so much of what happened around here is due to his leadership. And I was there to just kind of help. But the thing I wanted to point out, I see some students here, somebody that someday might get into politics. There is no way, now take it from somebody that's had a lot of experience, there's no way that you can win using road politics. And I'll give you the best example I can think of. When I had campaigned for that Senate seat back in 1961, most of these roads around here were dirt roads. And there was a road down here in Brasstown, Gunlog Road, really, that I told those folks I'd try to get paid for them if I got elected. Well, I got elected. And I went over to see Mr. Jim Gillis, who was the highway director. And I told him I just had to have a couple of miles of paving. And he blew me hanging like this, Bob. You were like that's asking an awful lot. And then he knew I'd been supporting the governor. And so he gave me about 2 miles of paving down there on Dunlop. Well, it tickled me to death. Just think of that. I couldn't wait to get home. And Saturday morning I got up early, and I went down to Gunlog, got in the car, and went down to Gunlog. First person I came to, he was out getting his mail out of the mailbox. I got out of the car and I went up to him. I'm not going to tell you these people's names to protect them. But anyway, I went up to him and I said, getting this road paved, I'm going to have it paved all the way down here near the Many Forks Church. He didn't say thank you. He said, I'm going to have to move this expletive mailbox. That's all he said. He went on back in the house. Well, I got in the car, went on down the road a little bit further till I came to this service station. I politicked there a lot. It was one of those, you know, where they had these glass cylinders up that you pump the gas up into it and then you let it drain that down into the car. I'd stop there a lot. Bought about $2 worth of gas at a time. I never filled up anywhere. That's something I've never done in politics. I buy gas back then, $2 or $3 or $5 a piece, so you can stop at a bunch of different service stations to see people. But anyway, I went into that service station, went into it, told him, well, I'm getting that road paved, And oh, that's good. He's good. Then he followed me on outside as I went to my car. And he says, you see here, talking about right in front of the store, he said, if they're going to pave that road, how about them paving right in here? He said, it ain't but about 20 feet to the road. How about paving right in here? I said, I don't think they would do that. That's private property. Oh, they'd do it if you'd ask them. So I left that fella antagonized. Went on down the road a little bit further, and I saw this man that I knew, and I got out, and I said, by then I was a good bit down the block. I said, paving the road, we're going to pave it right by your house, and right on down here, just up above the church. He said, you're not taking it to the county line? I said, no, I haven't got, it's just 2 miles, I can't take it. Well, he said, well, that's the ignorantest thing I've ever heard. I'm just back down here, not taking it to the county line. I got back in my car and I went back home. And road politics, folks, if you ever want to get messed up in it, it's not what you think it is.
It's been often said that Zell Miller knows more about Georgia politics than the Pope knows about the Lord's Prayer. How do you explain your ability to rebound from lost elections and bad decisions
And taking roads that don't go far enough? I tell this, I used to tell this to my students, especially in the lecture. I mean, there is no reason in the world, you can look up here, there's no reason that I ought to be able to sit up here having been a United States Senator and having been a governor. I mean, I didn't come from the right part of the state. There's only been 2 governors going up in the mountain that didn't come from the right part of the state back then. Didn't have the money. Didn't have the ability. And didn't have the looks. And didn't have... There's only one reason that I got to be where I got to be in politics. And that is that I just wouldn't quit. And I think I got that out of the Marine Corps. Persistence. Persistence, I tell students, and I'll tell you, persistence will beat anything. It'll be money, it'll be intelligence, it'll be anything if you just keep on. I was defeated 3 times before I ever made it to governor senator. Anybody else with any sense would have stopped and quit. I didn't have that much, I just kept on. Persistence.
After 4 terms as lieutenant governor, 16 years, you finally decided and pleased a number of your friends, including me, to run for governor. Why?
Because I'd quit bleeding over that 1980 election. I finally the cuts and the bruises had healed up. And it was a chance. I loved being lieutenant governor. I loved that job. They used to say, call me lieutenant governor for life, because I just stayed there for so long. But I loved that job. I loved the legislative process. I loved the give and take of it. I loved working out the compromises that can enable legislation to go through. But I got to thinking that if I'm ever going to run for governor, it was wide open in 1990, that was the time, I thought that was the time to do it.
You had 4 major opponents in that race. I would like to ask you for a quick assessment of each. Andrew Young.
Well, Andrew Young had been mayor and congressman and UN ambassador. I mean, Andrew Young was one of the great men of this era.
Roy Barnes.
Brilliant, very good legislator, brilliant.
Bubba McDonald.
He was the speaker's candidate, and that's almost enough said. He was the chairman of the Appropriations Committee and knew the budget back and forward. He could sing beautifully, couldn't he, Carl? He could sing beautifully. He was a good-looking person. He was a tough candidate.
Lester Mattis.
Well, I had worked for the man and knew him well. He had, as you know, had served as governor and as lieutenant governor, and now was running again. I felt a little sad for him, to tell you the truth.
You and Andrew Young wound up in a runoff. You went on to defeat Mr. Young, and after defeating him, you faced a very popular Republican, Johnny Isaacson,
Good man.
who of course is now United States Senator. As I recall, that was a very spirited and close election.
It was 53% to 45%. Yeah, it was a tough race. Johnny was a great candidate. Johnny can make you a great speech without any notes. He's very knowledgeable. He's a good, likable person. Some of you may remember that after that election was over, I appointed Johnny Isaacson as the chairman of the State Board of Education. I liked him a lot. I respect him and admire him a lot. You see, that race with Andy and Roy and the others that you had mentioned, and then later with Johnny, there wasn't but one issue in 1990. That was the lottery. You could get into all these side issues, but there wasn't but one thing, the lottery. And so it just dominated the race. You were either for that or against it. If you were for it, you know.
After defeating Isaacson and taking office, you learned that the state was on the verge of financial collapse. How did you manage to overcome that?
I had a lot of good help from the legislature, especially Speaker Murphy and others. It was a hard time. We had a budget back then of about $8 billion. And there was a huge shortfall because of the recession and because there was no rainy day fund left. And there were some hard times. And to give you an idea, we had in the regular session, then we had a special session that summer, And then in the next regular session, in those 3 sessions over a year period, we cut 5,000 jobs. There was room to cut them. One of the ways that I did it, and in a way, this was a blessing. It enabled us to streamline government a little bit better. But there were 2,000 jobs that were unfilled. There's always a number of jobs because of attrition that are unfilled. Well, there were 2,000 jobs out there that were unfilled. Well, we immediately did away with those. Then we began to quibble on the others, and eventually we cut 5,000 jobs, usually through attrition. We we did away with 200 programs in the budget. We trimmed 300 more items in the budget. And we managed to make it. And then when we did, the state rebounded in a tremendous way. But it was hard going right there to begin with, very hard. And I got a lot of good help from Speaker Murphy. Speaker Murphy and I had a lot of fights when we were lieutenant governor and governor. Whenever we were lieutenant governor and speaker. We had both come down there to the legislature at the same time in '61. He was a veteran of the Navy, I was a veteran of the Marine Corps. He was from rural Bremen, and I was from rural Young Harris. And he was Lester Maddox's floor leader. I was Lester Maddox's executive secretary. We had worked together and knew each other well. And the reason we thought so much, we saw things differently, a lot of things differently, but you just naturally have fights between the House and the Senate. If Tom Murphy hadn't been there, I would have invented one. And if I hadn't been over in the Senate, he'd have invented a Zell Miller to kind of rally the troops.
You'll always be remembered for cowboy boots and Hope scholarships. Tell us, if you will, where you got the idea for Hope scholarships. Give us a little history of Hope.
Well, being an educator from a family of educators, education has always been my main issue. And I have long carried around the idea of some kind of scholarship based on merit. But I didn't mention that during the election because I had no idea what kind of money the lottery would bring in. I mean, we were in an uncharted ocean. We were on the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. We didn't know where we were going. And so you couldn't promise too much. And so we just talked about the lottery and it going to education. But I had in my head a long time something like that. And where it came from was I had been able to go to high school here and be at home, go here to junior college and be at home. Money had not been a big issue to go to college until I finished Young Harris. Then it became a huge issue. My mama didn't have the money to send me anywhere very much. I got a part-time scholarship to Emory. She borrowed money from an outfit called Pickett Hatcher Educational Fund, and I started at Emory. And the money ran out, and we had to borrow some more, and I won't get into that. And then later, I went into the Marine Corps. Well, when I came out of the Marine Corps, I had the GI Bill. The GI Bill is the best government program that has ever been put into practice. And it was just great. And a lot of men got an education that never would have. So I had this, I had experienced going and getting an education with the GI Bill, and I'd experienced earlier having difficulty going to college because of money. And so I came up with this idea. I came up with the idea of this scholarship that would be based on merit, not need, and we would call it HOPE, Helping Outstanding Pupils Education. I named it. And it took a while to get it passed, but we got it passed, and we changed it a lot over the years. When we first started it, we didn't have enough money, so we had a $66,000 income cap for the families. Well, then we got enough money coming in, and we saw that we could raise that. We raised it up to $100,000 income cap. Well, that took in 96% of people in Georgia that, if you were under that. And so we might as well just go ahead and give it to everybody, and so that's how we did, and I was glad, because I didn't want it based on income. I wanted it based on merit, on keeping that B average. And there were a lot of people who got it, then didn't make it in college. We fully expected that. That's why we put the addition to it, but you could get it back. If you went to college and didn't keep that B average, it was taken away from you. But if you could go on to college and keep a B average for next year, you'd get it back. So it's worked pretty well, and a lot of young men and women have been able to go to college because of it, and practically every state in the union has tried to copy it. But they can't because they don't have the money to start it from, like we started it, with the proceeds going from the lottery, because 38 states already had lotteries, and they couldn't change it or they'd be taking money away from where their original lottery money was going.
In addition to the lottery and Hope scholarships, what would you say were the most major accomplishments of your 8 years as governor?
Oh boy, that's a setup question. Make me sound like I'm running again, but you asked the question. I'm very, very proud of what we did in education. And I want you to know now, Carlton Caldwell and the legislature and the speaker, a lot of them were extremely helpful. I didn't do this by myself, please believe that. But during that 8 years, we created the Hope Scholarship, and we also created pre-kindergarten, voluntary pre-kindergarten for 4-year-olds. No other state in the nation has that yet, except Georgia. It has not worked as well as I had thought. I thought it would do something with the dropout rate in this state, and it hasn't. And I was wrong about that. But I think it's helped in a lot of other ways. So education, we built $1 billion worth of construction on the university campus. We raised the university professors' salaries to the highest in the Southeast. We raised our teachers' salaries in Georgia to the highest in the Southeast, and up to the national average that everybody had said was a major coverage. So I was proud of that. I was proud that we cut welfare rolls long before the federal government came along with a welfare reform program. We cut the welfare rolls in Georgia during that 8 years by 42%. I wanted to cut it in half. We didn't quite cut it in half, but we cut it by 42%. The personal income in Georgia in that 8 years went up 60%. We created an average of 2,000 jobs a week. We built more prison beds than have ever been built. There were 24,000 prison beds in Georgia when I became governor. When I left, there were 44,000 prison beds in Georgia. That's bragging enough. But you got to remember what Dizzy Dean said. Dizzy Dean said it ain't bragging if you've done it.
You finished your...
And I'm proud of how we streamlined the government, and I've already talked about it. Go ahead.
You finished your 2 terms as one of the most popular governors Georgia ever had. What were you thinking when you left office?
How quick can I get to young Harris? I was teaching at Emory 3 days after I left the governor's office. And I also taught at the University of Georgia and at, of course, here. Taught a leadership course here. I wanted to come home. I was ready to come home. I thought my political career was over.
Well, then, were you surprised?
And many people think that it had been.
Were you then surprised when Governor Barnes appointed you to the United States Senate?
I'll be honest, I wasn't surprised he asked me. I was surprised I said yeah. I'll tell you this quick story. Paul Coverdale, who died and opened up that Senate seat, was a very, very good friend. He and I had served in the Senate together for 12 years. I was the leader of the Democrats. He was the leader of the Republicans. We were good friends. And that Coverdale Senate seat had come up in the year I left the governor's office. I could have run. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to go to Washington. And I wanted to come home. But anyway, when Senator Coverdale died suddenly, Governor Barnes called and said he wanted to come up here and talk to me. I knew what it was about. And you got to keep in mind that whoever he appointed, this was in July, whoever he appointed would have to run in November. So it had to be somebody that could get him up a campaign real quick. And so I knew I fit that category, and so I knew what he was coming for. I thought he did. I thought I did. When he came, he and I and Shirley sat in our living room. By the way, I got to stop. Another one of those things that happened during the administration that I'm so very proud of was what we did in adult literacy. And that's due solely to Shirley Miller. We put an adult literacy teacher in every county, and she did a tremendous job with that. And now maybe I'll get a little suffered now. I knew what he was coming up here for, and I knew what I was going to tell him. He told me he'd like to appoint me to take that seat. And I told him no, but I was as happy as I could be doing what I was doing. And we talked some more about it. And when he went out the door at the house, he spun around and came back in. And he said, "You got to do this, Zell. I don't have a plan B." I said, "Let me sleep on it a while." And so I slept on it for a couple of days. And Shirley and I talked about it. And one morning at breakfast, Shirley looked at me and she said, "This is what you do, isn't it?" Meaning politics, government. "This is what you do, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes." And I said, "Will you go with me?" I wasn't about to go up there by myself after. She said, "Yeah, I'll go with you." And I said these words to her. I said, "I'm not going to do that party stuff." And she said right back to me something she had heard me say many times. She said, "It's not whose team you're on, it's whose side you're on." I've said that a lot of times in my political career. It's not whose team you're on, it's whose side you're on. And so I picked up the phone and I called Governor Barnes and told him I would do it. And I went to Washington. I went to Atlanta, and we held a press conference. And in that press conference, I said, "I'm not going to serve any single party." I said that. I said it all during the campaign that followed. I was sick of that. And so I went to Washington. I was elected. There were 7 of us in that race, and I was elected. I went to Washington. And now you've got me in Washington, Bob. What else are we doing?
Well, I'd like for you to tell us your impression of the Senate when you arrived.
Well, I had wanted to go to Washington in my younger days. It's obviously. I don't think anybody that has been governor, a chief executive of a state, can be very happy in the Senate. It just doesn't move like you move in the executive branch. I was sitting at my desk one day. I guess I was looking pretty gloomy, and Joe Biden of Delaware came over. He'd been in the Senate since he was 30. In fact, he was elected when he was 29 and had to wait till he turned 30 to take his Senate seat. And he came over and sat down, and he said, "I've watched a lot of you governors come up here." He said, "You're all the same." He said, "You go through 3 stages. The first stage is you just can't believe this place." And he was right. I got up there in an appropriation period, and I couldn't believe it. Because you see, in Georgia and in state government, if you're going to add a program, you've got to cut something somewhere else. You've got a balanced budget you've got to work on. So if you're going to add a program of $300 million, let's say, you've got to come up with that $300 million somewhere. You just can't get it out of thin air. But you can in Washington. It doesn't matter how many, it doesn't matter how much you go over. Just keep adding to it. Anyway, so I couldn't believe it. He said, then the second stage is you get mad and you want to change this place. And the third stage is that you finally just accept it. I never got past that second stage.
Okay. You were governor.
I mean, I guess it was because of being governor that made me think a lot like that. You see, in state government, Carlton knows all this. In state government, you can just put an amendment, you can offer an amendment only if it's germane, only if it's part of the subject matter that you're discussing. In Congress, you can offer an amendment that it doesn't have to be germane or anything. You can be talking about highways and you can add something on education, and on and on. And so I didn't like the way it operated.
Who are your best friends in the Senate?
Those of us who had served as governors together, like Evan Dye of Indiana, Ben Nelson of Nebraska, Tom Harper of Delaware, George Allen of Virginia, and there were others. The best friend I came to have in the Senate was Phil Graham, who was the senator from Texas. He was a Georgia boy, born in Columbus. Grew up in Columbus, went to the University of Georgia, got his doctorate in economics from the University of Georgia, then moved to Texas. He was a very, very good friend. Jim Bunny from Kentucky, the Hall of Fame baseball pitcher, we were good friends. Warren Hatch from Utah, we became very good friends. I went up there and made a speech with him a couple of weeks ago.
You knew and were close to three presidents: Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. How would you describe each of these gentlemen?
Bob! We're already over this time. Aren't we? I'm going to try to answer that this way. Surely it's saved. I must have 20 some odd notes from Jimmy Carter. Keep in mind that I served in the state senate with him. I worked for him when he was governor. When he ran for president for a long time, I was the only elected state official who supported him for president. So we've been through a lot. And I must have 20 some odd notes. About half of those notes, he's bragging about something I did and commending me. About the other half, just giving me pure hell. So I'm just hitting about 500 with Jimmy Carter. He is tenacious, a modest man. He is not. He's won the Nobel Prize. Got to be president of the United States. It's quite an achievement.
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton. He is a political genius. He is brilliant. He has a photographic mind. He is a policy wonk, knows all your policy stuff, one of those propeller heads. But he also is charming and great with the people. He's the best politician that's come along in my lifetime. But he can be petulant and he can be deceptive. Move on.
George W. Bush.
Not what you see on television. And this is a shame. And I don't quite understand it. We hit it off when we were governors together because of our love for baseball. You know, he was the general manager for the Texas Rangers at one time. And so we got to know each other there. And I have a very high respect for him. Courageous man. History is going to be better to him than many think.
What was his best advice?
Good sense of humor. Go ahead.
What was the best advice you've ever been given?
Oh, that's an easy one. My mama. My mama used to say, take what you want, saith the Lord. Take it and pay for it. I was a grown man before I realized that's not in the Bible. That was my mama's trick. If you want something, you got to work for it. You want a house? Get the rocks out of the creek. You want to be a good baseball player? Practice. You want to be a good speaker? Work on it, writing that speech and practice it. Take what you want, take it and pay for it. Georgia, I could talk a lot about my mom. Okay.
Georgia's had 25 governors during the 20th century, dating back to Allen Candler in 1898 to Roy Barnes in 1998. Who, in your opinion, was the best governor?
How many pages have you got?
Very few.
This will seem strange. I think the best governor of the 20th century in Georgia was Herman Talmadge. And I say that because, not only because he educated me, but because of what he did. He had said, this is how politics works sometimes. He had said he wasn't going to raise taxes. And when he got elected governor, he put the 3-cent sales tax in. But that 3-cent sales tax did amazing things for Georgia. When Herman Talmadge became governor, there were over 1,700 one-room schoolhouses still in the state. He changed all that. Schools were built all over this state. The Hill-Burton Hospital Act was coming along at that time. And he built hospitals all over the state of Georgia. He built airfields. He built good roads. He was a very, very good governor. I'll tell you this, when I went to Washington, Robert Byrd, the old senator from West Virginia, came over to me and started talking to me. And this is what he said. He said, you know, Herman, and you know, he's been in the Senate now 50 years. He said, Herman Talmadge was the smartest man he ever served with in the Senate. And that's saying a lot from Robert Byrd. He was a very, very good governor, and I want to give him credit for that. I didn't mention that whenever I run against him, but Carl Sanders was not very far behind. Carl Sanders was an excellent governor. So was Ellis Arnold and Ed Rivers.
You served with Joe Frank Harris when he was governor, you were lieutenant governor, and George Busby.
I love them both. I love them. I have a picture of me and Busby the night that we were nominated. By my back doors, I go out my door every day, and I look up there and I see Busby. I love the man. He's dead, as you know. We were governor and lieutenant governor for 8 years, and then we'd all really served in the legislature. I'll tell you a story about George Busby. I may not have run for governor if it hadn't been for Busby. I went over to see him whenever I was thinking about running for governor. I wanted to see what my friend George would say, who knew me very, very well. And we had lunch. He worked for King and Spalding. We had lunch, and I asked him, I said, George, can I be elected governor? And I'll never forget what he told me. He looked at me, this very wise man. He looked at me and he says, Zell, not only can you be elected, but you can govern after you are elected. That coming from him just meant so much to me. I floated out of that building.
You have had a very illustrious career, teacher, politician. You're known to be a very wise man. Tell us what you think lies ahead for this country in the near future.
Well, the way you told me you wanted me to make a... By the way, you didn't ask me this question, and I was hoping you would. And so even if it takes a few more minutes, I'm going to ask you. I served with a lot of legislators, like Carlton and others. and they deserve so much of the credit. One of the legislators that I served with, that I think is probably the best legislator I ever served with, was a man named Denmark Gruber from Macon, Georgia, Bibb County. He had been a Marine aviator in World War II. He had been in that Black Sheep squadron under Pappy Boyman. And he was brilliant. He knew everything that was in a bill. He got to the Capitol about 6 o'clock in the morning and studied them and knew what was in them. And, you know, people's minds, legislators' minds are not changed by what the speaker says down there in that well. Very seldom. You already know how you're going to vote before somebody gets down there and starts speaking about it. Denmark Gruber could change votes, couldn't he, Carl? He could change votes. And he was a brilliant guy. Sometimes he'd be for me, sometimes he'd be against me. He helped pass the lottery legislation. He came to me right before it was to come up. You see, even though I had been elected, it was by no means assured that the people of Georgia would vote for it even after I got elected. So we had to have a referendum. And in order to have that referendum, I had to get 3/4 of the House and the Senate Parliament, 2/3 of it. Anyway, Denmark came down and he says, "I'm going to hit you on your lottery bill." Boy, that was news. That was good news to me. And then he said this, I'll never forget it. He said, "You know, men will do most men, I shouldn't get, I think he said men, not most, he said, men will do 3 things. They'll drink liquor, they'll chase women, and they'll gamble." He says, the stomach will take care of the first. Old age will take care of the second. But they'll never get over wanting to gamble. So I'm going to try to hit you with this piece of legislation. And he made the last speech before we went to vote on it. And I can hear it now. Shirley and I were listening to it down in the governor's office. You have what we call a squawk box down there where you can hear what they're saying. And Denny got up there and he said, I'm trying to remember, he said, the Constitution emanates from the people. And then he went on and talked about that the people ought to have the right to vote. Well, we carried the lottery vote by about 5 votes in the House. I don't think we would have carried it without Denny. So anyway, Denny's dead. He went on to his reward. I was there when that Marine bugler blew taps in his grave. But he was a good. And thanks for letting me get it in.
Now, going back to your, I wanted to ask you what you think's ahead for this country over the next generation.
Well, you asked me to make a list. I'm going to give that quick because we need to get on with this program. 1, this is what Bob said. List my 8 or 10 challenges that I think this nation faces. I wrote them down this morning. 1, this is the most. We face a well-armed, fanatical movement, just as dangerous as Hitler's Nazis or Japan's imperialism or Stalin's communism. Like them, it seeks a new world order. Iraq and Afghanistan are only 2 of its many battlefields. It will stop at nothing to dominate us, and as in past struggles, we do not have a choice. We either win or lose. We either deal with this problem now, or we leave it up to our children to deal with it. That's the main threat. We've got a political system, especially in Washington, paralyzed by partisanship. And far too often, they are working on not on what would be a result for the next generation, but an issue for the next election. 3, A large part of this country's underclass, not limited to color or ethnicity, that refuses to be educated or learn a skill, that creates babies in families that are not really families, and that glorifies violence. On the other end of the spectrum, a management class at too many of our largest corporations that steals from the stockholders and employees and whose sole goal is a quick buck for themselves. 5, a trade deficit disaster, a balance of payments so unequal that if unchecked can lead us to become a second-class power sooner than anyone might imagine. 6, a flood of illegal immigrants that gives us great labor and brave soldiers, but is overwhelming our schools and hospitals, social services, and law enforcement. 7, a defense establishment that today has the finest American soldiers ever produced, but is too small, too spread out, and too poorly paid to be the force that it must be. A system of government entitlements that, if not controlled, soon will literally bankrupt this nation. For we are close to the tipping point that many historians and economists have warned us about, where there will be more tax eaters than taxpayers. And last, a mainstream media that too frequently disdains our values, mocks God, and undermines this country. And there are others.
One last question before we agree to accept some questions from the audience. In your master's thesis on your family friend Ed Rivers, you wrote these words: history, not a man's contemporary, is the only judge of man's work. What should history say about Zell Miller?
Well, I am my contemporary. That's what I'm saying. I can't judge that. I hope they'll say that he never forgot where he came from.
So what's ahead for Zell Miller?
Well, if I get out of here before dark, I'm going to go walk my dogs down by Grass Down Creek.
Now, Senator Miller is ready to answer a few questions from the audience. I'm going to ask you to do this. Please raise your hand and be recognized, because we don't want everybody asking questions at once. Are there any questions? Sir.
Senator, where did you get the inspiration as governor to have the classical music and the fraternity award? My daughter lived all the way in California when her baby was born. She said, you know, Governor Miller said to do that. My kids listen to Brahms and Mozart.
Well, I read a bunch of studies that said that. It was not something that I just all of a sudden ordained that this is how it ought to be. I have read studies that it would be helpful. I don't know if it is or not, and I said so on that CD that we sent out. But it was some pretty good music, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Senator Miller, many of us are very worried about this I-3 project. Would you give
I'm sorry.
Many of us are very worried about the I-3 road that's to come through. Would you give us your opinion?
Well, here is my suggestion. You just sleep as easy tonight as you possibly can. That's never going to happen. The way that thing came into being was what they were trying to do. The man who came up with it, a good friend of mine, I know it, but was to try to get a 4-lane highway from Savannah to Augusta. Then another congressman came and said, let's take it to Dakota. And then, in order to get some other support, they moved it on up into Tennessee. That's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. No. Certainly not in my lifetime or your children's lifetime. I don't think it'll ever happen. I don't worry about it. And I would suggest you not worry about it. I know people like to go ahead and get names on petitions. I've had a few delivered to me in my day.
Other questions?
Yes, sir.
What is your opinion of Newt Gingrich and his future?
Newt Gingrich is a very, very intelligent individual who knows a great deal of history and a lot about politics. I would not underestimate him. He's on television every time you turn it on these days. He's got a new book out right now, and just had one out less than a year ago, so he's turning out a lot of books, and he's traveling around a lot. Newt and I go back all the way to 1966. He was teaching at West Georgia, I was teaching here. And when I ran for 1964, not 1966, 1964, when I ran against Congressman Landrum, Newt Gingrich was the campaign manager for Jack Prince, a poultry man from Georgia who ran on the Republican ticket against him after Landrum defeated me. I wouldn't underestimate him. He's a very, very, very smart person. Yes?
Senator, in your opinion, what do you feel can be done about special interests and the seeking tremendous amount of corruption in our government today?
Well, you're going to have to get a new set of folks up there that ain't corrupt. Money plays such a terrible, important role in politics. It's become a shame. When I ran for lieutenant governor in 1974, I didn't buy any television, didn't have the money to buy any television, bought very little radio. The way I got elected lieutenant governor is that for one solid year, Shirley earned the living. She earned it more than just 1 year. She earned that year. All I did was get in my car and drive all over the state of Georgia and see people. I would go to a county. I would go to a town. If it was a courthouse there, I'd go into the courthouse and go into every office. I'd come out of the courthouse, go down the street, shake every hand in every store on this side of the street, go out, cross, come back up, shake every hand there. I'd look up in the sky and see if there was an antenna, and there was a radio station there. I'd go say, "Won't you put me on the radio?" And they'd say, "We don't want to talk politics." I'd say, "Well, let's talk about country music." I can talk about country music. Let's talk about baseball. I can talk about baseball. I'd go try to get the picture made down at the county newspaper. I did that. I went into every village. I did that for a solid year. And that's how I got elected lieutenant governor. On $268,000. That paid for a primary, a runoff, and a general election. Today, you can't run for state representative for that much money. Casey Cagle running for lieutenant governor will probably spend $7 or $8 million. Money has become so important. When I ran for the Senate, and really, like the last time I ran for governor, I didn't travel around the state seeing people. I'd just get in a place and I'd call people and beg them for money. If they'd send me some money, then I'd give it to these folks and they'd buy television spots. It's got away from the people. And who's got in between us is the lobbyists. And the lobbyists furnish the money, they furnish the manpower, and until we break that cycle, I honestly don't know how we're going to deal with it. Yes?
I teach public speaking here. I see some of my students here. As a man who's given a lot of speeches, if you could give these students one piece of advice to succeed as speakers, what would it be?
Don't try to be like me. I don't think you're going to talk to the audience. Talk to them. Don't try to speak to them. Now, I'm somebody to talk. I've made so many speeches, I violate that all the time. I've made speeches off of the end of pickups. I've made speeches up on picnic tables. I've made speeches where we stacked up Coca-Cola crates, and I'd have to yell and holler and act silly and say things just to get attention. Don't do that. Also, it's according to whether you're speaking to a group or whether you're speaking over television. There's all the difference in the world these days. These people that were great stump speakers like Marvin Griffin and others in Georgia history, be lousy on television. Because you're in somebody's living room, and they don't want some idiot like Miller yelling in their living room. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
As you know, Roger Baldwin in the early 1900s started the ACLU. He was an atheist, communist, wanted to see this country turn to socialism, wanted to see all people that were in business, really, business pulled down. He was not in favor of anything good for this country. He only died in 1981, and we're still seeing the effects today of what he has done. We have heard you speaking on the venues about the immoral issues of this country and fully agree with you. Could you just give us some brief feelings or what your thinking is on where this country is going morally? How can we turn it around?
Well, I wrote a whole book about that called
Yes.
The Deficit of Decency.
Yes.
And the bridge to the future, I think, is out. And it's got to be rebuilt and restored. And you don't have to look any further than back to our founding fathers. I think George Bush said at the National Cathedral a few days after 9/11 that the commitment of our fathers is now the calling of our time. And I believe that. When I taught history here, I used to tell my students about that group that came over here on the Mayflower. Just think about that. They came across an uncharted ocean, to a wilderness. They had no idea what they were going to find. And they realized there'd be future generations like us who would wonder why anybody would put their children and their wives through something like that. And they wrote it down. The very first sentence in the Mayflower Compact says, "This voyage was taken for the glory of God." And then that's what of a Christian thing. That's why they came. And with the Bible under one arm and the musket under the other, they carved out a civilization. And they built their churches and their rush orders and their camp meeting grounds. And then you see that, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, where the good Lord is mentioned 5 times. And I always used to tell my students what Benjamin Franklin said whenever they were looking like they were going to break up and go home at a Constitutional Convention in 1787. And Ben Franklin, who was not an overly religious man, stood up and reminded them of how he said back when we were sensible of the danger, we used to ask for divine guidance. And he said, if we've forgotten, our prayers were answered. And then he said, I've lived a long, long time. And the longer I live, the more convinced I am of this truth, that God governs the affairs of man. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, how can a country endure without his aid? And then he said, I make a motion that we take a break and that we ask for guidance. And if you had it in a 50-minute history class, we'd go into it in more detail. They came back and in renewed atmosphere, they began to make these compromises, but finally they were able to work out and have a constitution. And then it was ratified by the states. And when George Washington was sworn in, he added to the oath, so help me God. And he bent and kissed the Bible. And I could go on, but that's what's missing. That's why it is the calling of our time to remember how this country was founded and what it means. And we have forgotten that. And I'm afraid that in too many of our educational institutions, that history is being diminished and our heritage is being diminished. And there's too many shades of gray and not enough absolute truths being taught.
There's a young man right here.
I know it. I met him when I came in the door. Are you sorry you came to this room?
Do you think it's much difficult to be elected senator or governor?
Well, it was harder getting elected governor, but it was easier being elected senator because I'd already had campaigns for so many years that I already had a lot of friends in a lot of different counties, and so I could go back to them. I know they said to themselves, I thought we'd got rid of them. Are we kidding?
What do you feel is going to happen in Iraq and Iran?
I got Iraq, but I didn't get what you said before that.
Iran.
What about Iran?
What do you think will happen in Iraq now and also in Iran?
If I knew that, I don't know. It's going to be a hard slog. It's going to be a very hard deal. But I know this, that as I said a while ago when Bob had asked me to name some of the challenges and threats that we have, I know that we've got to win. We can't afford to lose. We can't afford to put it off and let our children deal with it. And it's going to be a very, very tough situation to get that place straightened out over there. But we're there and we can't leave now. As far as Iran, we hear all this talk about that they want to have the nuclear bomb and that they could get it in the next they could perfect it in the next 4 or 5 years. Well, they don't have to perfect it. They can go buy one and have one in 24 hours by buying one from North Korea or even Pakistan, maybe. Some people in Pakistan. So it is a challenge that is as great, as I tried to say a while ago, it's as great as the generation who came before us faced in World War II. And we've just got to deal with it, and we've got to trust in the good Lord.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Senator Miller. You have certainly added to our forums on reflections, and we appreciate you being here today.
Let me just say this. I want to thank Bob for having these forums. This is a wonderful thing. I appreciate you asking me. I appreciate you putting up with the things that I said. And if I sounded like I was making light of some things that were really serious and important, I didn't mean to do that. I also want you to know how much this college means to me and how wonderful it is to be back in this chapel and to be with my wife of 52 years, soon to be 53, and my grandson over there is going to maybe be coming to Young Harris next year. And thank all of you for your interest. I have had a blessed life. God has been so good to me from the moment that I came into this world, with the mother that I had and the family that I had, the relatives that I had, and Dr. Clegg and Miss Heron and all the people who touched my lives. I was so blessed to have a wife that would put up with me these 52 years and stick with me in all these races. It's been a wonderful career that I've had, and I'm very grateful to the people of Georgia. And I'm grateful to have this opportunity to talk with all of you. May God bless all of you. He certainly blessed me.